going to talk to you about wildlife tourism, which is something that on a personal level I'm really quite passionate about. In this video, I'm going to tell you about lots of different types of wildlife tourism, and I'm sure that some of these are going to surprise you, so do watch till the end. And I'm going to tell you why some are really great, but others are absolutely terrible. Stay tuned to learn lots more about wildlife tourism. If you are new here, my name is Dr. Hayley Stainton and I'm here to teach you all about travel and tourism. So let's start off this video by answering the question, what exactly is wildlife tourism? Put simply, wildlife tourism is tourism that involves wildlife. But the important question here is, what actually is wildlife? And when does an animal stop being wild? Most types of animal tourism involves the use of animals that are or were once living in the wild. Whether it's a stray cat who was taken into a shelter or a zoo-based rhinoceros that was rescued from poachers, unless bred in captivity, the majority of animals that we see in the tourism industry do come from the wild. As such, wildlife tourism, in its broadest sense, encounters all types of tourism that involves animals. Types of wildlife tourism can then be segregated into two categories: animals in captivity and animals in the wild. And there are lots of different types of wildlife tourism, so let me tell you a bit about them. The United Nations estimates that tourism involving wildlife accounts for around 7% of all tourism around the world. However, they exclude animals that are in captivity, so in reality, this figure is likely to be much higher. From safaris in Tanzania to diving at the Great Barrier Reef, there are plenty of ways that tourists can watch and get up close and personal with wildlife. Some of the most common types of wildlife tourism around the world include safaris, zoos and aquariums, farms, animal rescue centres and sanctuaries, bird watching, whale watching, hunting and fishing, and diving. But we also have other types of wildlife tourism that I would describe as wildlife encounters. Many people are keen to get up close and personal with wildlife. Back in the noughties, everyone was doing it. If you had a photo of you and a baby tiger as your Facebook profile pic, you were one of the cool kids. Upload that same photo today and you will likely experience a barrage of abuse from your nature-loving friends and connections. Some types of wildlife encounters are great. Take volunteer work, for example. There are many conservation projects around the world that are desperate for volunteer tourists to help run their operations. However, most animal encounters are not so good. Animals are often drugged or abused to keep them calm around the tourists. They are kept in inhumane conditions and treated unethically. I mean, would you want to walk up and down the road all day long with people on your back, like elephants do in some parts of the world? Here are some of the most common examples of wildlife encounters that we see around the world. Swimming with dolphins, playing with lions and tigers, cuddling a panda, riding an elephant, visiting a cat cafe, shark cage diving, gorilla trekking, going to a monkey forest, riding an ostrich. Now, before you decide that wildlife tourism is all bad, I can tell you that it's not. And there are lots of really great things about wildlife tourism. Let me tell you some. Conservation. For many wildlife tourism businesses, conservation is their top priority. In fact, most places where the focus is conservation would rather not have any tourists come to visit at all. However, it's the tourists that pay the bills and allow their business to operate. Wildlife tourism businesses can be fantastic for conservation and can raise a lot of money. These types of businesses are usually charities or trusts. They do not make a profit and their intentions are generally wholesome. Research. Wildlife tourism also facilitates important research. Research can help us to further understand the animals and therefore to better cater for them, both in the wild and in captivity. Breeding programs. Many wildlife tourism projects have successful breeding programs. From Siberian tigers and pandas in China, to koalas in Australia, to lions in Botswana, there are successful breeding programs underway around the world. Many of these programs would not be able to operate without the money that is raised from tourists. Economic benefits. There are many positive economic impacts of wildlife tourism. Wildlife tourism brings tourists to a given area, and they bring money. They spend that money on hotels, on food, on transport, etc. This money can then be taken and reinvested into the economy and spent on other areas such as healthcare or education. Job creation. Another economic advantage of wildlife tourism is that it creates jobs. Whatever type of wildlife business it is, it will require some staff. Hiring people helps to boost employment figures in the area as well as boosting the overall economic prospects resulting from wildlife tourism. However, sadly, there are also many negative impacts that are associated with wildlife tourism. It has the potential to do so much good, but also to do so much bad. Many businesses are poorly managed and they demonstrate unethical behaviours. Let me give you some examples. Mistreatment of animals. The mistreatment of animals is common, especially in developing countries. Fortunately, there is a lot more awareness of this nowadays than there once was. Recent years have seen many laws and regulations introduced in the name of animal welfare all over the world. This has helped to reduce the mistreatment of animals in the wildlife tourism business. Nevertheless, mistreatment does still occur and it is pretty common. There are still circuses that use animals and attractions that make animals perform tricks for tourists. From elephant camps in Thailand to monkeys dressed as babies in Morocco. There are many examples of mistreatment around the world. Introduction of disease. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that we all understand that animals can pass disease onto humans. And this also works the other way around. When tourists are allowed to have close interaction with animals, there is a risk of them passing on illnesses that animals do not have an immunity to. A common cold might not be a big deal for a human, but it could kill a lion cub, for example. Most people who work in animal tourism are not trained in this field and could unintentionally introduce disease, either to humans or to the animals that they are working with. Animals are unpredictable and they can be dangerous. Elephants can easily trample people. Sharks can bite, and monkeys can give a person rabies, just to name a few. Changes in animal behaviour. Using animals in a tourism setting can have serious implications for its welfare and well-being. How would you respond if you were locked in a cage and only let out to perform tricks? I bet your behaviour would change. These behavioural changes can be unpredictable and dangerous for both the tourist and the animal. Reduced breeding success. When animals are taken away from their usual habitat and exposed to tourists, they may have trouble breeding. For businesses that claim to be conservation centres, this can actually have the opposite effect. Instead of protecting the species, it can exemplify and exasperate its extinction. So the moral of the story is that we all need to be responsible. Wildlife tourism isn't always bad, it can be really good. But we need to capitalise on those positive aspects and mitigate or at least minimise those negative aspects. From a tourist perspective, there's a few things that we can all do. Do your research before you go. If a wildlife tourism attraction has a bad reputation, you can probably find out this online. Of course, not everything can be found out online, but do your best to check it out before you go. Don't get too close. Getting too close can scare animals, it can affect their behaviour, can cause them to stop breeding, cause them to relocate, all sorts of things. It can also be dangerous. Sanctuaries and rescue centres are better than zoos. If you really want an animal experience, you should choose to visit a sanctuary or a research centre rather than a zoo. From the outside, the differences might not be that obvious, but from the inside, they're usually pretty big. Of course, some places do label themselves as sanctuaries or rescue centres when in reality, little conservation is involved, which is why you should try to do your research before you go, as I mentioned before. Don't mess with nature. Let nature be nature. Don't put clothes on animals, don't feed them, don't interfere with them. Just let them be. Avoid buying animal souvenirs. Be mindful of what you're buying. Sometimes souvenirs are made with ivy or animal fur, for example. This has involved the death of an animal, so it's not something that you should be fueling. Think carefully before you buy. And eat carefully. There are lots of different destinations that use wildlife in their food and their drink. In Vietnam, lots of backpackers think it's funny to drink snake's blood, but in reality, there's nothing funny or cool about killing a snake. In countries such as China and Japan, it's common to see shark on the menu in restaurants. And in Iceland, you can eat whale or puffin. Whether you're a vegetarian or not, eating endangered animals is never a good thing. Raise awareness about wildlife tourism. The most important thing that you can do is to raise awareness. If you visit a wildlife attraction that you think is doing a great job, tell people about it. Write a review on TripAdvisor. Every little helps. Likewise, if you see an attraction that's operating unethically, you should definitely speak out. This is especially important with smaller, lesser-known attractions. If nobody tells you, then you don't know. So there are a few tips. Let me know your experiences. Have you seen good things, bad things? What are your views on wildlife tourism? And let's just generally talk about it and get this out in the open because it's such an important topic that's not talked about enough. Now, if you found this video helpful, if you found it interesting, do me a favour and hit the like button so that YouTube will share it with more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, you can subscribe to my channel.